Thank you. My name is Billy. I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date's January the 5th of 1990. My home group is the Alpharetta Unity Group. And it's a real honor and privilege to be at Stateline again. I was thinking today about the last year as 2019 comes to a close, and I was thinking about my greatest AA-related moment of the year. And probably every year I don't have one of them, I mean, you would really have to think about that question. But this year I really had one, and I'll describe it for you. I was with one of my heroes. His name is Wallace B. from Sanford, North Carolina. I'm sure there are some people here who might know Wallace. Wallace was sentenced to 3 life terms plus 30 years, just in case they were going to let him out, in 1961. Wallace was 12-stepped by Tom I in 1964. He was released by the governor of North Carolina in 81, I want to say. But anyway, Wallace and I got to go to Angola prison. Specifically, we got to go to death row at Angola prison to visit 2 AA members who were on death row there. And if you've never heard of Angola or seen it on the news or been there, it is a pretty ominous place in the middle of a swamp, all 3 sides of it covered by the Mississippi River and alligators, and then one side where you can get in and get out. But I bring that up because something happened with Wallace's reservations, and of course he was staying an hour away from Angola. And so I was driving him to his hotel so that I can then drive back an hour to Angola. But as we were driving, we were about 10 minutes out of the front gate in the middle of nowhere, Louisiana. And of course, the sheriff's lights come on behind us, and we get pulled over. And I just remember that 3 minutes as that sheriff was running our license plate, me and Wallace sitting in that car. I'm thinking, God, if they get Wallace's record, we're really going in tonight. Like, mine's bad enough, but his is like... But me and Wallace looked at each other. I did what I was taught a long time ago, which is not what I used to do. I turned on the interior light. I rolled down all the windows. I put on my emergency flashers. When the sheriff walked up, I apologized for whatever he was going to tell me I did wrong, which Louisiana is an interesting place, I've found out. He had told me that I just entered a speed trap, and he asked us where we were coming from, and I said Angola prison, and I knew that was going in a bad direction right away. But I never mentioned Alcoholics Anonymous, never mentioned AA. We had been there at an all-day event. And that sheriff was nice enough. Truthfully, me and Wallace looked at each other like, why didn't this used to happen to us? He said, yeah, I could tell you in a rental car. He goes, the speed trap ends at the 3rd gas station at the next light. I was like, wow, they even tell you where the speed trap ends in Louisiana. They did not give us a summons. They said, have a good night. But me and Wallace looked at each other before we pulled out, and we were just like, this is kind of surreal. The 2 of us, we just pulled out of a prison. Both of our records are not great, but yet we've been restored to full citizenship. Full citizenship that I have a driver's license, full citizenship that we both know how to be respectful to the men and women of law enforcement who are out there doing a hard job every day. And I think about that, to way back when I met Tom and, I have a topic tonight, and I was assigned this topic, and I'll do the best I can with it. And all I could tell anyone that maybe would not like something that I say tonight is to please go to AA conference-approved literature. And if I say something that doesn't coincide with AA conference-approved literature, I'd be the first one to tell you I'm sorry. But I'm going to try to stick to what AA says about a bunch of topics. I think it's important to note that we are in a different time in Alcoholics Anonymous. On the plane as I was coming here, someone who I see every once in a while who speaks at conferences sent me a text, because if you were to go right now to www.aa-meetings.online, if you were to go there right now, it would look like an AA central office. When you click on that on your phone or on your computer, when you bring it up, AA meeting online. For AA meeting location and times, please call. But the first heartbreaking thing about that is that it's not AA. Like if you were to call that number, the first thing they would ask you is if you have insurance. So a newcomer looking for a meeting, looking to have their life saved, that's what they would get greeted with. They would be greeted with that they're willing to fly them to wherever treatment center they can get them to if they have insurance. And I couldn't be a bigger supporter of treatment in the world, to be perfectly honest. I would give a big shout out to Dr. Silkworth if he could hear me. I would give a big shout out to Charlie Towns, who owned Towns Hospital that employed Dr. Silkworth. That without that, I mean, people can say all they want. We say some horrible things sometimes about treatment and people in the treatment business. But the truth is, none of us would be here without Charlie Towns and Dr. Silkworth. If Bill Wilson did not go to a treatment center called Towns Hospital, none of us are here. So I have to make that clear of how much respect I have for the men and women who work with us every day in their professional capacity. But when you start disguising an AA meeting directory to look like an AA meeting directory. And the hard part for a lot of people in this room that are going to really have a big resentment against me after tonight is the following. Is a lot of you know the people who are behind that ad. A lot of you have invited the people that are behind the ads like these to speak at the conventions that you host in your towns and cities. It's just a dirty little secret that we don't talk about in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I know that's the brutal, brutal truth. But it's the truth. Professionalism really has two sides to it. There's our job, which is really the only one we can do. And our job has two sides to it as well. Number one, when we go into a facility, a treatment center, a detox, a correctional facility, a recovery house, as much as this is the gathering of the AA activists of all AA activists, we have to admit that AA is really, really tall and really narrow. We're not good at a lot of things. We're good at one thing in particular. Sometimes that's hard to really wrap your arms around. Because a lot of times, Tom I used to talk about this all the time. In fact, he wrote a great thing that's in the corrections workbook today. Tom designed it. It was called not the fourth step, but the four-step process. It was about what local AAs should do when they're invited by a correctional facility or a prison or a rehab or a detox, that Tom felt that we should interview them at the same time they're interviewing us. Because what we need to find out first and foremost is, do they want Alcoholics Anonymous? Or do they want something else? Do they want maybe AA and something? Do they want some kind of maybe 1 3/4 legacy instead of 3 legacy AA? Do they want the traditions and the steps, but without the first step, and maybe minus a couple of the traditions? And Tom, who was a much greater gifted speaker than I, would always tell people, those people deserve AA. Good old 100%, 3 legacy, 36 spiritual principle, Alcoholics Anonymous. If you're bringing anything less than that to them, what would have happened to you if someone did that to you when you came into Alcoholics Anonymous? So that is definitely one side of the AA member responsibility. What are we bringing into these places? The other side is, what are we allowing to come in to our meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, or our conventions, or our big book workshops? You know, I am a 1980s circa version newcomer in AA who came into AA in the early 1980s as a teenager and didn't get sober until 1990, but, you know, give or take, I am a 80s hairband version newcomer, Alcoholics Anonymous, who got sober right around early hip-hop. But I would tell you, we used to just complain about the van. We used to complain the vans in the parking lot. And they were sending all the vans to the same place because they only have one van. And they're sending other people besides alcoholics to our meetings. And I could do a 4-day workshop on being a teenager in Alcoholics Anonymous in the 80s and everything I heard back then. But that's not the problem today. At least back then, the van stayed in the parking lot. The driver did not go behind the podium like in Alcoholics Anonymous today. It was, as much as the old-timers complained in the 80s and the 90s, the message of that treatment center stayed at least in the van, or one of the people who couldn't help but share, one of the newcomers, but it didn't make it behind the podium. The podium was sacred for the message of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it seemed that back then, people wore 2 hats a lot better. You know, Mari and I talk a lot about certain subjects, and, you know, I loved when she talked about that there's 2 groups of people in Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, there's the Bill Wilson people and the Dr. Bob Smith people, but today I run into a third. I run into the paid recovery movement that is inside Alcoholics Anonymous. Doesn't matter whether they're a Bill or Bob person. And sometimes I think we really, and I know it might not be popular to say, but to charge for something that you received for free, for me, is a question that I run through my head. You know, we believe that we suffer from something that only God can take care of. That's a pretty strong statement. You know, people have already talked this weekend about Dr. Young meeting Roland, and Roland meeting Ebby, and Ebby meeting Bill, and Bill meeting Bob. If you back up that story one person, you know, what happened to Dr. Young? We're all here because of what happened to Dr. Young. If that had not happened, none of us are here. Dr. Young in 1909 was a die-hard follower of Sigmund Freud. He didn't believe in any of this crazy hocus-pocus, higher power, God stuff. He was a die-hard follower of Sigmund Freud. And thank God in 1909, Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, was given out an award. And they invited Dr. Freud. And Dr. Freud, like any old-timer, brought a protege with him. And that protege was Dr. Carl Jung. And while Freud, you can Google him, he gave a lot of important talks during that gathering at Clark. But while he was doing that, Jung was outside carrying his bags and waiting. And thank God he was outside, because he ran into a man who wrote a book that you can find in the archives room. He ran into William James, who wrote The Varieties of Religious Experiences. And while talking to him, William James told him that what he believed in was hocus pocus, all this Freudian stuff. Because William James believed in the power of God. William James explained to Dr. Young that since the beginning of the times, there had been people who had sudden, vital, spiritual experiences that completely changed them. Almost like Marilyn. I loved Marilyn probably because I was an atheist when I came in. I personally thought all the speakers here have been great, but for me, she could have just dropped this microphone on the floor and I could have left Stateline. That's how much she affected me. But that's what William James did to Dr. Young. He explained that there were certain things that man and medicine and science could not fix. But these things had happened. Like the man, even though the music was already written, the man who wrote the words to Amazing Grace. Those words have lived on for decade after decade after decade. Words written by a man who was a slave ship captain, who had a sudden, vital, spiritual experience that completely transformed him, and he became a minister. If you do a little research, if you want to check up on what I'm telling you tonight, you will see that Dr. Young only lasted about another year and a half in his relationship with Freud. They had a clean break in 1912. And when you think about seconds and inches and all of us in this room, William James only lived 10 months after meeting Dr. Carl Jung. Imagine if they had never met. And sometimes I think it's hard for the outside world that I live in every day, that is based on money and prestige and all these other things. It's hard to accept, I guess, for a lot of people that There are certain things that only God can fix. But that's what our book tells us. Our book tells us that's one of the main reasons of our book. I would just want to comment on a couple of things Ralph said, because it's going to lead me on to where I want to go. If you listen to a lot of speaker tapes, and some people will say, and by the way, I just want to give a little tip for next year for Stateline for the whole cell phone thing. I don't know if anybody here ever heard of of Judge Jack. He was one of my favorite speakers on the East Coast. He was a judge in Virginia or Maryland. But what he used to do is he used to say he's been dealing with alcoholics his whole life. So when the invention of cell phones came, he used to say, hey, I deal with you people every day in my courtroom. So take out your phone and turn it all the way up, because I know you're going to do exactly opposite of what I say. So take your phone out and turn it all the way up. Little tip from Judge Jack. But a lot of times people will say, well, I already have that speaker tape. Why would you buy another one? Why do you need another Clancy tape? Why do you need another Karen G tape? Why do you need another Don P tape? Why do you need another Tom I tape? Ralph might not realize this yet, but I'm sure he will be thinking about what he said Thursday night for a long time. But if you're a student and you stay a student and you listen to speakers, the great thing about listening to the same speaker over time is, 95% of it might be the same. No doubt about it. But if you listen closely, there's going to be about 2 or 3% that they never meant to make public, and it slipped out. It slipped out big time. And for whatever reason, they were totally vulnerable in that particular hour. Because what I got from what Ralph said is that, as hard as it is to admit it, AA is more important than any of us individually. It doesn't matter how good any of us think we are at AA. It doesn't matter what pages we know. It doesn't matter how good we think we are with the worst case sponsees. None of that matters. What matters, what I heard from Ralph, is that AA is more important than any of us. And then when the chips get down, you better be still connected to AA. And that's the most important time to be here. We all know you see somebody a lot at a meeting you haven't seen lately, just a little free public service announcement. That's not a sign their life is going good. Okay? When you start to see somebody you haven't seen in a while, it's usually a sign that something's going on. Because we're the kind of people that when things are going good, we start to give ourselves the credit. We forget that it's not God or a sponsor or AA. You know, and he really reminded me, I always talk about the Time magazine book that they published in 2000, the 80 Days That Changed the World of the 20th Century. That in 1998, Time magazine hires the most celebrated academic historians in the world and gives them one assignment. Start on January the 1st of 1900 and end on today's date, and we need you to tell us the 80 most important days. Not a committee of AA archivists, not a committee of AA trustees, not a committee of AA speakers, just the best historians. And Ralph put into words when you go 13 pages into that book, you land on Mother's Day 1935, where that Time magazine book says one of the 80 most important days is when a broken stockbroker from New York met a broken surgeon from Akron, and from that meeting led to the birth of Alcoholics Anonymous. And do we always treat AA like it's one of the 80 most important things that happened in the 20th century? If that page is not enough to hit you over the head, go a couple of pages before or a couple of pages after and see what they're comparing AA to. Women voting, Jackie Robinson playing in the first Major League Baseball game as a black man, the I Had a Dream speech, landing on the moon, the wall coming down. That's what the most celebrated academics in the world say AA is equal to. That's what Ralph's talk did for me. And it also reminded me, Mike talked a lot about Chuck C. when he was getting over his resentment of not being the banquet speaker tonight. And Chuck was a master, a true master. But when you listen to a lot of tapes of people, sometimes they let something out. I've listened to a lot of Chuck tapes. One night he let something out. And it has made me think about what Ralph talked about. AA is more important than any of us, because Chuck talked about living in wherever he lived in Laguna Beach and driving an hour and a half to go speak at an AA meeting in California. And when he was at that meeting and having a cup of coffee or whatever, and someone said to him, "That guy's at his first meeting." And so Chuck did what Ralph did. He went off script. He went off the speaker script. He started telling some things about himself. And in this particular tape, he said he started talking to himself, his ego. That he started telling himself he needed to tell the best AA story ever that night because someone was at his first meeting. And so he gave the talk that night, and Chuck continues on the tape that as he drove home to Laguna, he said to himself, "That was the greatest AA talk I ever gave. I hit it completely out of the park." So, another year or so goes by. Chuck goes back to that meeting. I'm sure in California at that time, meetings had Chuck every year at their group. I could only imagine. And so Chuck talks about going back to that meeting. And guess who's there? The guy who had one day the year before. And so Chuck, he admits this on the tape. He says, I got to find out exactly what sentence it was that saved his life. I need to know which was the real magic elixir, that these words of gold that came out of my mouth. And so he talks to the guy, and he says, "Hey, I was at your meeting last year when you were at your first meeting, and you've been sober ever since?" And the guy says, "Yep, I have." And Chuck says, I got to ask you, I'm curious, what got you to your second meeting? And the guy looks at Chuck, he says two things. First thing he says is, I was so out of it that night, I don't even remember who was speaking. That's the first thing he says. But the second thing he said reminds me of Ralph's talk from Thursday night. Because the second thing he says is, but I was sitting at that table and I had burned down everything in my life the way Max described this morning. There was not a person who would want to talk to me. I had destroyed every relationship. And there was an elderly lady sitting across from me, and when I was out of cigarettes, she rolled a cigarette across the table to me and pushed her lighter or matches across. And he said to Chuck that that was the first nice thing anybody had done for him since he could remember. And I took Chuck's message that sometimes we forget that compassion is not outdated in Alcoholics Anonymous. And whether the person has 1 day or 50 years, when they walk across the threshold into your meeting place, you don't know what load they are bearing on their shoulders that day. You don't know what a simple act of compassion could do. And so, Ralph really made me remember that story about Chuck, that we need to remember that AA is more important than any of us that are here. Now, having said that, I want to skip to Sharon, because this is really where I want to go. Sharon made a comment about how sometimes, for people with time, it is uncomfortable when the people before them are no longer here, and her quote was, "When you get pushed into the front row." And there is no doubt that there are a lot of people being pushed into the front row these days. I thought about it today as I was reading a little AA literature and made a little list, just my list. This is just the list of a 15-year-old boy who came into Alcoholics Anonymous as a teenager and got sober at age 23, is a 1980s, 1990s era newcomer, since I was a newcomer for like a lot of years. But I thought about, as I go around the country and Canada, I think about those people that have given up some seats. I think about those people who, as a 1990s era alcoholic, really impacted me. I could start in lower or northern San Diego County with Cliff. He was already mentioned today. What a giant he was. I could make a quick stop at the synagogue at the Pacific Group, and I could think about Clint and Vince and Karen and Frank, right? I listened to those tapes forever. I could go up to Canada, two men that were instrumental in Tom's life, a man named Cecil and a man named Elmer. At the time, they were the longest running sponsorship relationship in Alcoholics Anonymous. I could go over and think about Reverend Ed. I could think about Don P. I could think about Keith L. I could think about Mike W. I could think about David A. I could think about Joe and Charlie. All these giants that are no longer here. I could think about Tom, who's not well enough to travel but is still alive. I could think about a giant in Al-Anon named Mary Pearl, who used to be my favorite Al-Anon speaker when I went to AA conventions. And I think about all those people, and there are so many more, but those are ones in my crazy tape library, right? But when you think about all of them, most of them, I have no idea what they did for a living. Most of them, I know what their home group was. Most of them, they were day in, day out, just 3 legacy AA members. That's it. Nothing more to report. That's what was in fashion back then. Because sometimes in today's AA world, I speak a lot publicly for work, a lot. How would you feel if I came in this room tonight and said, you know what, we've had enough of this AA stuff. Enough of this language out of our literature, language out of our big book, language out of AA Comes of Age. We're going to have a little seminar about actuarial insurance tonight. That's what we're going to do. I want you to know that my title at work, just so you know how important I am, is Managing Director, Executive Vice President. I want to start throwing out some terms during my talk tonight about insurance. I'm going to talk about IBNR, aggregates, total cost of loss, development factors. I'm going to talk about adjusted allocated expense ratios. I'm going to talk about all of that for the next hour. And you would be like, that's crazy. But why is it not crazy when people employed in the treatment industry come behind our podiums and just use that language for an hour at our AA events? Why is it crazy for me to talk to you for an hour about insurance during an AA convention, but it's not crazy for someone to advertise what they do for a living related to selling recovery services when they're speaking at an AA convention? Why is me doing it crazy, but them not? I think there's a lot of inventory for Alcoholics Anonymous to take over the next 10 years as to where we're going. Because the language that's been brought in is not our language. It's not the language of the big book. It's not the language of the 12 and 12. It's not the language of As Bill Sees It. It's not the language of Dr. Bob and the good old timers. Instead, we have the language of chemical dependency and substance abuse disorder and who's clean and using instead of drinking, and I could go on and on. How did it become acceptable for that to happen, but I'm not allowed to give you an hour-long class on actuarial tables? And I would just ask you to think about that. Don P. had a night like Ralph had too, which is a night like Chuck had. He had a vulnerable moment where on one of his tapes, he let something out. He let out a little prediction of his. That prediction has kind of come true a little bit. So for those that don't know and want to know about the so-called big book revolution in Alcoholics Anonymous, it really started exploding in 1980, particularly after 4th of July weekend 1980. Leading up to 1980, two men named Joe and Charlie, they described themselves as two old guys who liked to read the book together. They did a couple of workshops here and there, but at New Orleans, at the International Convention, they did a Joe and Charlie Big Book workshop preceding that convention. Their lives were never the same, ever. They would tour all around the world, bringing the message of the Big Book to places where the Big Book wasn't popular. And then you would have people who would follow in their footsteps, the Gary B's, the Don P's, the Mark H's, the Joe H's, all of this Big Book movement. But one night, like I said, Don had a Ralph moment. On one of these tapes, Don said his worry was that they were creating too many First Legacy only AA members. That they were becoming so good at taking people through the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous that they were forgetting to tell them what kept AA there all along to begin with, which is our great 12 traditions. The very thing that's enabled us to stay here. And Don made that prediction one night. Sometimes I see the set-aside prayer and I hear people talk about its origins. It was not written to be separate from the rest of AA. It was an assignment going through the steps from one sponsor to a sponsee who felt that they had become so engulfed in First Legacy only recovery that they had disconnected from the rest of Alcoholics Anonymous. That's where the set-aside prayer comes from. I'll go back to Chuck C. for a second. In the early 1970s, there's a little-known meeting of great importance in Alcoholics Anonymous that happened in Southern California at Chuck's house. At that time, to be a trustee on the General Service Board of Alcoholics Anonymous, there was a question where you had to answer if you were employed in the paid recovery industry, because they wanted to make sure that you knew how to wear one hat at a time. And if there's anyone here who's not familiar with that term, I would hope that you get a couple of David A. from Dallas, Texas tapes on the traditions, where he talks about the ability to wear one hat at a time, that AA members are not good at wearing two hats at one time, that when we're in AA, we're AA. When we're outside, we're outside. And Chuck was very worried about removing that question from the trustee application, that he had this kind of famous meeting at his house. And today, I have a lot of great friends who are employed in the recovery industry and wear their hats appropriately. But we really have to be honest about what's going on. Sometimes I think, because we all are people pleasers, we just want to be people pleasers, especially when it comes to AA events and AA conventions. I kind of gave this talk at Bob's sponsorship retreat, and I took a lot of flack, and I said when I was giving that talk, I just want to be on record that I said at the beginning of that talk that by the end of today, what I say is going to get somewhere, and there's going to be some people who do not like it. And there were some people who do not like it. But it hurts me that we are allowing people to use our AA events to further their professional careers. You shouldn't be able to go to somebody's professional recovery website and find all their AA service speaking commitments listed. But yet you can. So all these conventions, which I will not name, they're all being used to further the brand of paid recovery. And I know I'm not supposed to let people know that, but it's just the truth. It's just happening every day. Last week, if you don't believe what I say, and I'm going to use both real-life AA experience and documented history. Last week, a couple of our members entered a plea in a federal case. What's great about that plea and the underlying records is they weren't found guilty, they admitted to it. And inside those documents, people who are going to conventions and using AA to build their business describe the business plan in Alcoholics Anonymous of 2019. How to use local meetings and conferences and conventions to build your treatment business. How to use newcomers and pay them $100 referral fees to send people to your recovery house. That's not made up. That's not my opinion. Just passing on what someone admitted to. And now, all across the country, it seems, there's this new thing that's happening in Alcoholics Anonymous, where paid recovery facilities are calling up central offices and starting a new meeting in their facility. Except that meeting doesn't have trusted servants. It's chaired by one or two people that work at that facility. And it's listed as a beginner's meeting. And what's the purpose of that? Well, the purpose of that is to find new people who they can sign up for intensive outpatient. Now, again, I don't care what those people do in their life. I care what's happening on the AA side of the line. That we have a duty to present Alcoholics Anonymous to newcomers who believe they're coming to AA in a way that we would want it presented to us or was presented to us. If you like AA history and you're interested about what goes on in the world, I would just tell you that there's a great man to read. His name is Dr. George Vaillant. Dr. Vaillant was considered at one time the world's authority on alcoholism, except the rest of the treatment world couldn't stand him. If you met him, I met him a few times. He served as a non-alcoholic trustee. He looked like somebody I would not like to begin with. He looked like the guy who was at Harvard. He had that kind of professor long hair, even though he was too old for that kind of long hair. He had the horn-rimmed glasses, the tweed jacket with the elbow patches. And I'm saying this because Dr. Vaillant is a good friend of mine today. But when you would go anywhere around the world, even at an AA convention, the one thing you would know if Vaillant was in the room is you would know because the fire marshal would be outside the door. Like people would come long and far to hear Vaillant. They would be laying in the middle on the ground, all against the wall. I remember one time I went to this conference in Texas and Vaillant was on the program and all these people showed up that the host committee never thought would show up. And they thought they just invited this non-alcoholic trustee. But Vaillant gave very treatment answers. I remember being there, a young doctor who worked with alcoholics got up to the microphone to ask Dr. Vaillant a question. And I remember when Dr. Vaillant looked at him and said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I don't have the physician's desk reference in my book, in my office. I only have 2 books in my office, the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12 and 12. And he told the guy, "I basically get paid a couple $100 an hour to convince rich people that they need to go to AA for free." And then another person got up and talked about how devastating it was to work with people like us every day, day in, day out. And Vaillant looked at them and said, "Oh, you have to understand that I accepted a long time ago that I do not have the power to help alcoholics. I know people read my books and they know that I'm in charge of alcoholism at Harvard, but they don't like to hear that I don't have the power. In fact, I suggest to anyone who's going to make a career of working with people like you who will disappoint me every day that you might want to join the Worldwide Fellowship of Al-Anon Family Groups because I have found a lot of solace with the men and women of Al-Anon." And I think about that, and I say this for this reason. Somebody already mentioned it this weekend. There are a lot of people who work in the industry who don't come back to meetings. There are a lot of people who get burnt out by people like me, because I'll burn you out. I will burn you out. You will try to do so much to help me, but I am going to disappoint you every step of the way. And I think about that. I already told you I work in insurance, specifically construction and real estate insurance. The last thing I want to do when I come home is talk about the insurance on the Oakland Raiders' new stadium in Las Vegas. If I worked in that industry 10 or 12 hours a day, 8 hours a day, I can only imagine. Like, we need to do a better job, I think, of reaching out to the great men and women who are working in that industry and making sure that we're just their fellow brother or sister alcoholic. I also want to talk about sober living houses for a little bit. There are some really great ones out there. And when you read the purpose of sober living, especially if you read some of the old California records, It was to give a man or woman the necessities of life: food, clothes, and shelter. And after that, to allow them to get a foundation in some 12-step fellowship: Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, whatever it is, wherever they need to go. But today, it's kind of changed a little bit. There's still some great ones out there, but I run into a much different dynamic today. I run into a dynamic when I ask a young kid what his home group is, and he told me it's the house meeting on Thursday night. And I'm like, what's the house meeting? Oh, you know, all the guys in the house and all the alumni, they come together. And I'm like, that's awesome that they have that, but that's not an AA home group. Sometimes people ask me, do you have, what would your wish about AA have? I have a couple. I wish that no big book was sold without the AA group pamphlet in the middle of it. I wish that everyone would get that AA group pamphlet and see that there is a difference between meetings and groups. I wish that everyone who would take people through the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, even though we have no dues or fees and we don't have pledges, blah, blah, blah. But if we did have a pledge, or we did have a swearing-in ceremony, I wish we would swear people in and say something like, you agree that you are not going to take someone through the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous unless they agree that when you're done with that, you are also going to take them through the 12 traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous. Because we do not need to send one legacy people around AA who have no experience with our 12 traditions. All it does is cause more disunity, like Mari talked about. I wish we would do that. I'll end just by talking about a favorite topic of mine, which is singleness of purpose. And unfortunately, not all, but some of the paid recovery movement has decided that every problem is the same. I don't need to go through their litany of a drug is a drug, or, that it's all the same. I could point to the shade behind me. We have a lot of people who like to yell out loud that the only place alcohol is mentioned is the first step. I will go back to Joe and Charlie. If you're working the steps off the wall, you have an off-the-wall program. I have remembered that my whole life. Because sometimes I think we forget that if you open up this big book, regardless of the edition, so what? The first 12 steps plus the doctor's opinion are in the Roman numerals in the first 106 pages or so at the end of working with others. Well, leaf through that book one day and count how many pages in the first 40 or so are about the first step and identification. Identification as an alcoholic. That doesn't seem to coincide with alcohol is only mentioned in the first step. I left to come here. I had to go Wednesday to a Christmas party in Florida for work. And as I was leaving the door, I saw I was guilty. I did see Rich, who was calling before I answered. And it was someone I know who is a very active person who speaks a lot in Alcoholics Anonymous. And they asked me if I just had 3 minutes, that they had something that was really bothering them. And he said that a sponsee of his had just OD'd and was barely alive. And he said he didn't have any phone numbers in his phone of people in NA or HA. And, you know, for me, what happened to me is that there is another meeting location that has meetings a lot of times a day down the street from my home group. And I just got tired, like Mari talked about. I got tired of walking in there and turning to get a cup of coffee and looking at the bulletin board and seeing yet another notice there for another memorial service for another young kid I know in Alcoholics Anonymous who OD'd on heroin. And it just keeps happening and happening. And so I needed to really arm myself with the facts. I needed to check my ego at the door, that I do meet people who clearly are not alcoholic. I can't buy into what the people from the treatment industry are telling me, that everybody's the same. I need to realize that some of these people, they deserve identification like I deserved it. And I need to have the phone numbers. Sometimes it's so easy to attack other 12-step fellowships. There are as passionate people in those fellowships as there are here. Just as passionate about their recovery as we are. And I'm not saying kick anyone outside of AA. If you're an alcoholic, I could care less what you are. Overeater, sex addict, gambling addict, have whatever other problem you want, as long as one of them is alcoholism. But I can't let my ego sentence someone to death because I don't want to give up a sponsee, because they might actually really be able to identify in one of those other fellowships. At the end of the day, I mean, we're all happy. We're in Vegas. I won a couple of dollars the last couple of days. I'm happy. Happy to be around passionate people in AA. I said exactly what Rich said. I said it last year. The rest of AA is all glad that we're all here this weekend. But sometimes at the end of the day, we forget that we're dealing with a life and death matter. Life and death. That's just the way it goes. Life and death. And so I leave you with two things. One, my mom died January of 2000. I was barely 10 years sober. On Christmas Eve of 1999, I got to go to her hospice. I got to wake up early that morning. I got to get her wig, her Charlie perfume, her eyeshadow, her crazy Irish music and her boombox, pictures of her kitten, stopped at Dunkin' Donuts. Anyone knows I'm a big D&D fan, the greatest coffee in the history of coffee. I stopped and got 2 large coffees. You know, I don't know if you've ever had someone in a hospice. I am the greatest supporter of hospices, and if there's anyone here that works in that industry, it's so great because people are dying and they don't tell them. It's not like a hospital. At a hospital, they're like, oh, you can have the clear broth diet, a couple of ice chips. At hospices, they treat people with dignity. Oh, you can have the steak, you can have Remy Martin, you can have, smoke Marlboros when you could still smoke in a hospice in the guest room. My mother wanted a Dunkin' Donuts coffee. And so when I went there that morning and we were chugging back 2 Dunkin' Donuts coffees, as I was sitting up, we had propped up her bed, and I'm sitting next to her like I'm throwing back a tall boy, a Budweiser. If you've ever dealt with someone, they're in and out of, you're talking to them, then they're not there. Then you're talking to them. But at one point, my mother turned to me and said, Billy, whatever you do, do not leave Alcoholics Anonymous. because Alcoholics Anonymous allowed me to get a quart of milk. Now, my mom had become a member of the Worldwide Fellowship of Al-Anon. I always joke around that a lot of other people in AA will say, there's nothing worse than a belly full of booze and a head full of AA. I always tell you, if you're a chronic, progressive teenage alcoholic, there's nothing worse than a belly full of booze and your mom's head full of Al-Anon. That is worse, much worse. But I said to her, Mom, what does getting a quart of milk have to do with me being in AA? And she said, Billy, you will never understand what it's like to be the spouse or the parent. Maybe someday you will, but you don't know now. You don't know what it's like to be on the other side. You don't know what it's like to run out of milk and make the decision not to go to the store because at night the stores aren't as crowded. And when the stores aren't as crowded, if you run into somebody you know, you might have to talk to them. And if you have to talk to them, they might ask you the most difficult question in the world, like, how are your children? She said, in somewhere inside your sobriety, it crossed a line. I couldn't wait. I could not wait for someone to stop me in the supermarket and ask me, how are your children? I couldn't wait to shout from the rooftop the miracles that the Worldwide Fellowship of Al-Anon and AA have brought our family. I think my mother sums it up so much better. I want to give a little plug for the AA Grapevine. I know we all like to complain about it. But over the last 6 months, they've really seemed to make a change. There seems to be a lot more articles about recovery from alcoholism, about being a 3 Legacy member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I believe there is a grapevine from British Columbia. The grapevine chair is here. Where are you? Are you in the room? Over there. That lady right there. Table 59. Because if you don't like the way the grapevine's been, the only way to change that is to get a subscription and participate. Because the last thing I'm going to tell you tonight, they recently wrote something of mine in there. Wasn't original. It was a question that I was asked on a stage about 1.5 years ago after I rotated out as trustee. And I will leave that with you. The question is, a lot of great speakers here. Sometimes they like to put us all on a panel, like we have some great wisdom together to answer questions out of an ask-it basket. And there's a lot of the usual subject questions. But somebody came up with a question that really made me think. What did you learn while you were a trustee? It's a great question. And I want to pass on to you and end what I learned. Today is December 14th, 2019. All around the world today, thousands of men and women will attend their first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. Thousands. I hope they are welcomed with an uncomfortable chair and a bad cup of coffee and the people that Max described that they can't stand when they're new. I hope that. And I know as I stand here today, 1 year from now, a lot of those people will celebrate anniversaries at whatever crazy anniversary meeting their home group has in December of 2020. But I know as I stand here today, next year, next December, the loved ones, the brothers, the wives, everybody else, when they go down those church basement stairs or into that clubhouse, you can tell who they are, especially at year 1 anniversary. from day 0 to year 1 is miraculous. And those people with the tears in their eyes, because their son or their daughter or their husband or their wife are still alive, not sober, still alive. And they all are thinking the same thing. They're thinking, oh my God, all the money and all the love couldn't put Max back together again, but this crazy, odd collection of people who look like a mix between the Island of Misfit Toys and the Cheers bar, like this crazy collection of odd people, have been able to deliver something to my loved one that I couldn't buy or I couldn't love. That is amazing. And that is Alcoholics Anonymous. But unfortunately, I also know as I stand here today that a lot of people who the only crime they ever committed is having the same disease that I suffer from, who were alive yesterday on December 13th, 2019, are no longer with us. They were alive yesterday, and they are dead today. I know that it's not only tragic that most alcoholics die drunk, it is tragic that most die without ever hearing about Alcoholics Anonymous. I also know that things happened last night that can't be changed. Whatever the rest of the world wants to think about money and science and everything else, I'm pushing my chips all in on Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm pushing my chips in on what God has been able to do through the power of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that is not old-fashioned. Thank you very much for having me.